So apparently conservation is failing. I read this paper, and then I also read a paper that has counter arguments. Let's get into it. Hi guys, welcome back to another video. Welcome back to another episode of environmental news. This is my favorite series on the channel because I like going off. I like reading interesting things, and I like sharing the interesting things I read on the internet about environmental sciences. Again, told you, juicy news that don't involve me, I'm there. We are spilling the tea. In this case, the water. Anyway, the other day, I was doing research for another video that's going to go up on the channel, and I came across this paper that claims that conservation as we know it is failing and something needs to change. Something needs to change, you know when you meet someone, they're like,
this is not working, something needs to change, this and this are wrong, these are my solutions.
But then you listen closely and you're like, I feel like your solutions are not based on science. I feel like your solutions are just your opinions. But I'm not taking sides.
Well, I will try not to take sides.
I'm a conservationist at heart. I'm an environmental science graduate. So I feel like you guys will know which side I'm leaning on, but I'll try not make it too obvious, okay? So first, let's go through the original paper, because the first paper I read was the counter argument, and the way this person was just like, no, tearing them apart. I was like, woo, I feel like I need to read the original paper because bro, I feel like I need to know what they said first. Okay, I need to know where this started. So let's read the original paper first. The paper is titled Conservation in the Anthropocene Beyond Solitude and Fragility. And I'm gonna just list the main points of the paper so as to not make this video super long. Basically, they're saying conservation is failing by its own metrics, and biodiversity is declining. Why are we still doing this conservation? Despite having so many protected areas, destruction continues. So what's the point? They say protected areas are insufficient and sometimes they're harmful because those parks that we create for conservation displace indigenous people, and millions are affected by these forced relocations, and they are ineffective anyway, which leads to high rates of deforestation of surrounding areas. And they're saying nature is resilient, not fragile. Why have scientists painted this picture that nature is fragile? We are overstating it. Ecosystems recover well from major disturbances. Species adapt and often thrive in human modified environments. Why do we need to set aside land for species conservation? Species are fine. They're not gonna die. They're gonna survive. They're gonna adapt. And the Anthropocene demands a new conservation vision. Humans shape almost all of the Earth system, and in this reality, this needs to be embraced, not resisted. I feel like my tone is already a little bit biased. I'm sorry, I cannot help it. And they say conservation must align with human development. It should integrate human needs. Efforts that pit humans against nature are unsustainable and unethical. Conservationists should work with development. We should engage corporations and technologies. Should not work against them. They should work to benefit both people and ecosystems. According to them, the new human-centered conservation approach should be to support development by design, not by restriction. Basically, incorporate nature into places that humans inhabit. Do not set aside land for conservation because that takes land away from humans. 2, we should focus on nature that sustains human communities, not just iconic species. We should recognize nature in cities, farms, and working lands, not just remote pristine pristine areas, and we should collaborate with human communities, businesses, and governments. Those are the main points of the OG paper the authors were tearing apart, the other authors. The next paper, the paper I read, and I was like, ooh, I feel like I need to make a video about this because
hectic.
This paper is titled, What is the Future of Conservation? Actually, wait, let me pull up the paper. So they talk about the previous paper that some people are claiming that conservation as we know it is very not useful, it's ineffective, what's the point, why are we still doing things this way, we need to change, we need a new approach in the Anthropocene era. They challenge this new conservation science. They're like, nah man, there's quite a couple of claims that you guys have made, and one by one we're going to go through them and we're going to talk about why they're wrong or why they're not how you paint them to be. Okay, so these are the counter arguments. I will try to state what the argument was before going into the counter argument so that there's like balance. Okay, so this is not leaning in a certain direction, although you already know which side I'm leaning. I haven't even said anything, but you guys know. First of all, let's look at my notes. The first argument was that conservation focuses too much on biodiversity conservation and negatively impacts people, businesses, and development, especially people from disadvantaged background. They claimed that the primary objective should be to protect and restore and enhance services that nature provides to people, not just on nature itself. And the counter argument was human well-being is already one of the core features of environmental conservation policy and planning. That by definition, environmental conservation is the protection of natural resources for current and future generations. We are allowed to use natural resources as long as it is sustainably, because they were claiming that people are being kicked out to protect this pristine environment that nobody should touch. But the counter argument here is conservation involves the use of nature in a sustainable way. We are sustaining it for humans, not for humans not to touch, not to engage with. The second claim was conservation is based on the myth of a perfect, pristine nature, and that the goal is to conserve and restore this perfect state. That is why we create parks that people should not go to, etc., etc. However, the counter argument for this was that conservation already takes a realistic view of nature's purity and fragility, and that the new conservation science basically overstates nature's resilience. Remember, I said they say nature is resilient, it can bounce back, but they conveniently leave out the fact that extinction is a thing, you know, and there are irreversible harms to the environment that can happen. Just saying nature will bounce back, animals will adapt, etc., it's not good enough, because we do know of certain species that have went extinct and they're never coming back. They conveniently leave out the fact that there is irreparable harm that can come to the environment that nobody can fix. And I remember reading one of the points, they were like, oh, scientists claim that some species, all species, if they are lost, they cause a cascade effect on ecosystems and ecosystem services. And they were saying, they gave an example of the dodo. Actually, they were like, the dodo is gone, nothing has changed. However, I would like to counter argue and say, just because you do not see a change that has come upon a natural system does not mean a change is not there. Again, every animal, every organism has its role. Think of the foods, what do we call it? The food pyramid, the food system. In a landscape, you have the predator, you have the prey. The prey is also a predator to something else. It's a cycle. All the animals depend on each other. If you remove one organism from the chain, there will be effects. And just because you do not see the effects does not mean they were not there. It just means nature did adapt. That I agree with. It means nature did adapt to fill in that space left by that one species that went extinct. So I would like to argue, just because you do not see the change, it does not mean the change is not there. Next, they were claiming that conservation has failed to protect biodiversity, and they claim that even though so many protected areas exist, extinctions and ecosystem degradation continue. And they actually quoted, or they cited, another paper, which I then went and I was like, okay, fine, let's look at your references. I went to the references and I read the paper. Basically, the conclusion of the paper they are citing as their source does not say conservation is failing. It says conservation cannot keep up with the rate of biodiversity loss. So conservation is not failing. It's just taking a little bit longer to conserve species, not at the rate at which they are being lost, because the rate at which species loss is happening is way higher. However, without conservation, and this is also said in the paper, without conservation, way more species would have been gone by now. Basically, conservation has helped slow down the rate of species loss.
I am biased. I've accepted. You know what? I have accepted that I cannot be neutral in this topic. I'm sorry, okay?
They claim that there is no strong evidence to suggest that conservation is working, etc., which, I mean, there's a lot of case studies you can look at that do prove that conservation is helping. Basically, they were talking about, in the paper with the counter arguments, the paper I highlighted a lot, they're talking about moral values versus economic arguments. So they're saying that new conservation science is based more on value choices than scientific facts, and specifically the belief that human welfare outweighs nature's intrinsic value. I remember reading in the original article, they were like, we should focus conservation more on natural systems that benefit humans. So humans are king, and we should only conserve systems that benefit humans. It's useless to protect nature for nature's own sake. We need to protect nature for humans' sake, which personally I do not believe in, because who's gonna advocate for nature, you know? If we're going to advocate for ourselves and be like, we're going to protect only the natural systems that benefit us, what about the natural systems that do not benefit us, so they can be destroyed? Remember, they play a role. The Amazon, even though I do not live in the Amazon, plays a role, and somehow I do still get benefited from it existing. Next, they talk about concerns about corporate partnerships. Remember, I talked in the original paper, they're like, we should partner with economies, we should partner with development companies, corporations, etc. But the counter-argument paper states that partnering with corporations is risky because businesses often contribute significantly to environmental degradation. We've seen that companies cause more harm than good, and companies make promises but actually don't stick to those promises, don't actually take actions and do the things they've committed to. A green economy have failed. These green economy efforts have failed to deliver real conservation outcomes. How can we then trust them? How can we then base our conservation strategies on corporations? And lastly, they talked about diverse conservation motivations are crucial, and the authors of the counter-argument paper warned that narrowing conservation goals to only human-centered outcomes weakens its moral and political foundation. At the end of the day, conservation is not centered around humans, and it should not be centered around humans. In its development, the concept of conservation, it was not centered around humans. Why should we change it? It's not going to benefit us in the long run. If you think about it, it's not going to benefit us. And that is the paper, guys. Tell me, what do you think? What do you think? Conservation should evolve. the things that we've been doing in the past, if they're not working, I do agree that we need to look at them and change them for the better. However, I do not think conservation efforts should be centered around humans. That does not make sense to me. As a human, that does not make sense to me. And the intrinsic value of nature should remain central to conservation. We should not reduce conservation to be a tool of economic development. I will put a link to both articles in the description box. What do you think of this new conservation science? What do you think of this counter-argument paper? Let me know. That is the interesting paper I read in the past couple of weeks, because I think I read it 3 weeks now. That has been another episode of Conservation News. Let me know what you think. I enjoyed reading those 2 papers and being flabbergasted and gasping and highlighting. I will see you guys in my next video. Bye.